In the frozen silence of an Alaskan night, the radio caught a sound that should not exist. It throbbed through the static like the heartbeat of something alien, steady, relentless, inhuman. From that moment, life at the naval station would never be the same. It was October of 1978. The U.S. Navy's remote listening post, Fort St. James, clung to the ragged shoreline of Prince William Sound like an unwanted outpost at the edge of the world. The wind never stopped here. It screamed across the water and howled through the steel towers that held the antennas, stripping paint from the buildings and shaking the barracks as if the entire place were a ship caught in a storm. For most of the sailors, the duty was punishment. 200 miles from Anchorage, cut off from the rest of the country by mountains, glaciers, and the unrelenting cold. The station's job was simple: track Soviet submarines moving silently beneath the northern Pacific. For years, the work had been routine, the nights uneventful. Until the night the signal came. Petty Officer 3rd Class Richard Caldwell was 27 years old, restless, and already weary of the silence that swallowed the base after midnight. He had learned long ago how to recognize interference. The playful flicker of auroras, the unpredictable stutter of solar storms, the sudden bursts of static when the ionosphere bent and cracked. But at exactly 11:47 p.m. on October 21st, the pattern in his headphones froze him in place. A signal pulsed with surgical precision, one sharp burst every 23 seconds. Not a wavering beat, not the usual chaos of nature, but a rhythm so perfect it felt mechanical, deliberate. The frequency locked at 77 kilohertz, an empty stretch of the spectrum, a place where the world was supposed to be silent. Caldwell checked everything: contacts, amplifier tubes, antenna calibration. He even shut the receiver down, let it cool, and brought it back to life. The signal returned immediately, as if it had been waiting for him. Then the spectrum analyzer spat out the result. The source was not in the ionosphere, not in the sky, not bouncing from some faraway transmitter across the ocean. The signal was coming from the ground itself. More precisely, from beneath the rocky surface of a nameless island in the middle of the bay. The island was little more than a lump of black stone rising from the gray water, less than a square mile wide, treeless and barren. The local Inuit called it Nunavaktak, the land where you must not step. They avoided it at all costs. Caldwell had once asked an old fisherman in Valdez why, and the man's eyes had gone flat and distant as he muttered about stone spirals, about men who spent the night there and returned white-haired and broken. Some, he said, never returned at all. Caldwell had laughed then, but the sound now in his headphones drained the laughter out of him. Every pulse of the signal seemed to shiver through the building itself. At first he thought it was his imagination, but the pencil on his desk trembled each time, rolling slowly toward the edge. The overhead light flickered once, twice, in perfect unison with the bursts of sound. He felt his stomach twist as though the earth itself were answering some buried command. He leaned back in his chair, staring through the frost-lined window at the black water stretching toward the island. The moon cast a faint silver glow over the bay, and in that glow the outline of Nunavaktak stood like the humped back of some ancient beast frozen in stone. He thought of the stories again, and for the first time he did not smile. At 12:10 a.m., he logged the readings in the station's journal. His handwriting was sharp, mechanical, the way it always was when recording routine interference. But at the bottom, just before signing his name, he added something unusual, a single line outside the language of technical reports. "The signal feels too perfect," he wrote, "too alive. Nothing that steady should be coming from an empty island." The report from Caldwell could not be ignored. Within a week, the Navy dispatched a small commission to Fort St. James, 3 men who arrived on a gray morning, their boots crunching on frost as they stepped off the transport plane. Lieutenant Commander James Harlow, the officer in charge, carried the stiff posture of a man who had spent too many years in uniform. Beside him walked Raymond Ellis, a radio engineer from San Diego, thin and restless, his eyes always darting toward the horizon. The third, Dr. Samuel Carter, was a civilian geologist attached to the Navy's research branch, a quiet man with a lined face who seemed older than his 40 years. Their orders were simple: verify the anomaly, identify its source, and file a preliminary assessment. Harlow treated it as routine business. Ellis couldn't hide his excitement at the possibility of a new transmission source. Carter said little, but the way he studied the shoreline from the boat betrayed attention he could not put into words. The weather turned against them the moment they left the dock. The sea was steel gray, the wind cutting across the waves like knives, and the sky hung so low it felt as though the clouds were pressing down upon the water. 2 enlisted men rowed them the half-mile toward Nunavaktak, the forbidden island. None of them spoke during the crossing. The only sound was the creak of oars and the steady hiss of the wind. The island rose out of the bay like the back of some drowned giant. The surface was jagged, barren, utterly lifeless. No trees, no brush, not even the tough moss that clung to other nearby rocks. Just raw stone, dark as coal, streaked with white frost. From a distance, the place looked empty. But as they drew near, Carter was the first to notice the shapes. Circles, spirals, patterns too deliberate to be natural. They made landfall on the island's southern shore, boots sinking into gritty black sand. The 3 men climbed a short rise and then stopped, staring. Before them stretched a series of stone rings, some 30 or 40 feet across, built from boulders so heavy it was difficult to imagine how they had been moved. At the center of each spiral lay a single polished stone, black and mirror-smooth, the size of a human head. 13 spirals in all, spread across the island like a pattern drawn by some unseen hand. Harlow muttered something under his breath. Ellis approached one of the stones, crouching to examine its glossy surface. He reached out with one gloved hand, then hesitated, but curiosity overcame caution. His fingertips brushed the rock. He jerked back instantly. "It's warm," he whispered. He stripped the glove away, pressed his bare palm to the stone. A faint spark leapt between his skin and the black surface, like the sting of static electricity. The stone pulsed faintly beneath his touch, as though it contained a heartbeat of its own. The geologist knelt beside him, running a hand along the outer boulders. "Granite, mostly. Local material," Carter said, his voice low. "But these central stones, they're different, polished beyond reason. Too smooth. You can see your face in them like a mirror." Indeed, the reflection was uncanny. Harlow leaned over the black stone, expecting a dull blur. Instead, his own features stared back at him with startling clarity. The eyes sharp, the expression faintly distorted, as if something behind the glass surface were looking through him. The wind rose, sweeping across the barren island. Harlow stepped back. Ellis wiped sweat from his brow despite the freezing air. Carter only stared at the spirals, a troubled crease deepening in his forehead. That night, back at the station, Harlow requested a meeting with the local liaison, an elderly Inuit man named Noah Ikak, who had lived in the region all his life. At first, the man refused to speak of the island. Only when pressed did he share the old stories, his voice trembling as though even the memory carried weight. He told them the people once called Nunavaktak a place of walking shadows. Fishermen who strayed there aged overnight, hair turning white as snow before they set foot again on shore. Others vanished without trace. The elders warned that the stones were not stones at all but eyes, watching from beneath the earth, waiting for the living to draw near. "Do not stay after dark," the old man said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "At night the dead circle there. They walk and they call for company." Harlow dismissed it as superstition in his official notes, but the words lingered. The 3 men had seen too much to ignore the unease curling in their stomachs. Those spirals were no accident of geology. Something had been built on that island long before the Navy ever came to Alaska, something that still lived in the silence beneath the stone. And as they prepared their report, all 3 felt the same unspoken certainty, that the signal Richard Caldwell had heard was not simply a trick of radio waves. It was a summons, and now someone had answered it. On the night of November 2nd, he signed into the duty log as usual. The entry was neat, his handwriting precise. "Signal stronger tonight. Interval shortening. Will recalibrate antenna." That was at 11:40 p.m. It was the last line he would ever write. By dawn, his station chair sat empty. The receiver still hummed with the same unnerving rhythm. Bursts every 23 seconds, but Caldwell was gone. Search parties swept the barracks, the shoreline, even the narrow trails leading into the mountains. No footprints, no torn fabric, no blood. Nothing. 3 days later, an enlisted sailor spotted something half buried in the rocks at the water's edge, directly across the bay from Nunavaktak. It was Caldwell's binoculars, the heavy Navy-issue pair he always carried on night watch. They had been set carefully upon the stones, not dropped, not broken. Both lenses were fogged with a thin glaze of frost, though the air temperature was several degrees above freezing. That detail unsettled the investigators most of all. Frost without cold. Ice where no ice should have been. Rumors spread quickly through Fort St. James. Caldwell hadn't deserted. They whispered. He had been taken. Some swore they heard his voice bleeding through the static, calling faintly during the long intervals between pulses. Others claimed the signal itself seemed to shift when they approached the equipment, as though it were listening, as though it were alive. The official report called his disappearance an accident, perhaps a fall into the icy water. But no one at the station believed it. Caldwell had been swallowed, they said, claimed by the island that pulsed like a beating heart in the middle of the bay. From that night on, men began to flinch when the bursts rattled through the headphones. No one wanted the midnight shift, and when the signal spiked, sharp and insistent, it no longer sounded like mere interference. It sounded like breathing. The Navy could not dismiss Caldwell's disappearance as an accident. 2 weeks later, a second expedition was ordered to Nunavaktak. This time the team was chosen carefully. Major Robert Kane from Naval Intelligence, a man with a reputation for solving the unsolvable. Dr. Alan Hughes, a physicist from MIT who had spent his career studying anomalies in electromagnetic fields, and Dr. Marcus Shaw, a geologist whose specialty was volcanic structures. They arrived grim and silent, carrying instruments that looked more suited to a laboratory than a windswept island. From the moment they landed, the signal pulsed stronger, almost eager, as though it had been waiting. Hughes set up synchronized chronometers to measure time flow across different points of the island. Within an hour, his hands shook as he recorded the results. Clocks left at the water's edge ran normally. Clocks carried into the spirals lagged seconds behind for every hour. Time is slower here, Hughes whispered. It's measurable, real. The men avoided saying the word, but all three were thinking it. Impossible. That night, as the wind scoured the island, the men lay awake in their tent. Kane wrote in his field journal that faint scraping sounds carried across the stone. Not footsteps, not animals. More like something shifting within the rocks themselves. The sound rose and fell untraceable, as if the island itself was moving in its sleep. The next morning, Dr. Shaw ventured into the largest spiral with a set of instruments. He pressed his hand to the central stone, black and polished as a mirror. For a moment nothing happened. Then his face went slack. He dropped his notebook, staring ahead with eyes wide and empty. Hughes and Kane rushed to him, calling his name. Shaw blinked but did not answer. He stumbled like a sleepwalker, unresisting as they dragged him out of the spiral. When they reached the shoreline, his eyes cleared. He looked around in confusion, unaware that nearly 40 minutes had passed. I remember setting down the case, he said, his voice trembling. Then nothing, just a blank. Kane closed the journal with a snap. He had seen enough. The report he filed would be cautious, stripped of superstition. But the truth was clear to all three men. The spirals were not ruins. They were active. They were affecting the flow of time. And anyone who lingered too long risked losing not just minutes or hours, but themselves. By December the bay was locked in ice. Nunavaktak sat imprisoned within a white field that stretched unbroken to the horizon. The sea silenced beneath a frozen lid. The men at Fort St. James thought the ice would isolate the island, cut it off, bury the strange pulses under miles of frozen water. Instead, the opposite happened. The signals grew stronger. What had once been a steady beat began to branch into new patterns. Bursts doubled, tripled, layered themselves into chords that no natural phenomenon could produce. At times the receivers howled with so many overlapping tones that men tore off their headphones, clutching their ears. And within that chaos, late at night, fragments of something else appeared, whispers, syllables that no one recognized. A language that was not English, not Russian, not Inuit. Words rising from the ice itself. Technicians marked another disturbing change. The signals no longer came solely from the heart of the island. They now echoed outward, radiating from the frozen sea around it, as if the ice had become an extension of the source. Hydrophones lowered beneath the surface captured the same unnatural pulses, vibrating through the water in perfect rhythm with the radio bursts. The effect on the locals was immediate. Fishermen from Valdez and Cordova began to vanish. One man failed to return from his nets. His empty boat drifted ashore, lines coiled neatly as if packed away by unseen hands. Another was last seen crossing the ice on skis. The next day, his gear was found upright in the snow, bindings unfastened, as though he had calmly stepped out of them before walking into nothing. Entire villages whispered that the sea was taking men, that the ice itself was opening beneath them. By the end of January, the Navy's logbooks filled with nervous handwriting. The men on duty admitted, though never in their official reports, that they dreaded the moment the signals flared. They swore the pulses carried intention, that the rhythms shifted in response to their presence, quickening when they approached the receivers, softening when they backed away. It no longer felt like listening to static, felt like being watched. February brought the third expedition. The command in Washington had grown alarmed by the mounting reports of missing fishermen and the strange signals spreading across the frozen bay. This time the group was larger, better equipped, 2 officers from Naval Intelligence, a physicist from the University of Chicago, a geologist from the U.S. Geological Survey, and a squad of Marines to serve as protection. They crossed the ice on a moonless night, roped together in case the sea opened beneath their boots. Their lanterns cast thin cones of light across the endless white, and every man felt the oppressive silence pressing down from the dark sky. Hours into their crossing, the first sign appeared. At the center of the frozen sheet, beneath layers of ice, a glow began to shimmer. Pale blue at first, faint as starlight. Then stronger, pulsing in perfect rhythm with the signals still hammering through the receivers back at Fort St. James. The scientists stopped dead, staring through the frost at the impossible light seeping upward as though the island itself were breathing beneath the ice. The Marines shifted uneasily, gripping their rifles. None of them spoke. By the time they reached Nunavaktak, the glow had spread. The spirals of stone were rimmed with frost that gleamed with a blue radiance, as if veins of light were pushing through the rock from below. The physicist set up his instruments, hands trembling. "The field strength is increasing," he whispered. "It's not just radiation. It's patterned, organized. It's signaling." His words dissolved into the wind, but everyone heard the fear behind them. Then came the movement. At first it seemed like nothing more than shadows lengthening in the spiral center, stretching unnaturally against the glow. But the shadows grew darker, sharper, until a shape began to rise. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its outline human yet blurred, a body made of smoke that moved against the wind. And where its eyes should have been, 2 points of blue fire burned, pulsing with each beat of the subterranean signal. One of the Marines cursed and raised his rifle, but Kane, the lead officer, snapped out a warning. "Don't fire. Don't move." Yet it was too late. The figure tilted its head, the light in its eyes flashing like twin beacons. The signal in their radios erupted into a shriek, so loud and jagged that men fell to their knees, clutching their ears. The geologist stumbled back, babbling, his pupils blown wide. Another Marine shouted that he saw faces in the smoke. Familiar faces, friends and brothers long dead, beckoning him forward. Panic swept the group. They broke formation, stumbling across the ice, some dragging the scientist who had collapsed into convulsions. Behind them the figure advanced slowly, never hurrying, its steps in perfect rhythm with the pounding signal. The blue light flared higher, painting the snow with a sickly glow that followed them as they retreated. They did not stop until they reached the far side of the bay, lungs burning, legs numb with frost. When they finally dared look back, the island lay dark again, the glow extinguished as though it had never been. But the damage was done. Several men reported violent headaches and nausea that night. The geologist awoke screaming, unable to remember his own name for several hours. The physicist, pale and trembling, admitted he could no longer tell whether time was moving normally. His watch ticked steadily, but he swore hours passed in seconds and minutes stretched into eternity. In the weeks that followed, nightmares spread among them like a contagion. Some dreamed of endless spirals of stone, others of blue eyes hovering in the dark. A Marine confessed that every night he heard whispers calling him back across the ice, promising answers if only he returned. The expedition's official report ended with a single line from Major Kane. Recommend immediate cessation of field activity. Island is not inert. Island is aware. By March, the signals no longer belonged to Nunavaktak alone. Receivers at Fort St. James began to pick up identical pulses from other points in the bay, small, nameless islands that had never before registered anything but silence. The pattern was spreading, multiplying, as though the first spiral had awakened others long dormant. The sea itself began to change. Fishermen spoke of seals gathering in unnatural numbers, blanketing the ice in great herds. They did not bark or scatter at the sight of men but lay silent, their black eyes fixed on the horizon. Whales surfaced far from their normal migratory paths, circling in tight patterns for hours, releasing low, mournful cries that carried for miles. At night the sound rolled across the bay like a dirge, a chorus that seemed to answer the pulses coming from beneath the earth. Reports filtered in from nearby villages. Hunters crossing the ice at dusk claimed to hear chanting, human voices where no humans should have been. One woman swore she saw a procession moving across the frozen bay, dozens of figures in dark clothing, walking hand in hand toward Nunavaktak. She called out, but they did not answer. Instead, as one, the entire group turned their heads toward her. Even at a distance she felt their gaze, heavy and cold, before they turned back and continued walking. A search party later followed her tracks to the spot, finding only a trail of footprints pressed deep into the snow. The prints stretched for half a mile across the ice, perfectly aligned, all heading toward the forbidden island. Then, without warning, the trail stopped. No cracks in the ice, no signs of collapse. Simply an abrupt end, as if the walkers had stepped into thin air. Whispers spread quickly. The villagers said the dead were rising to answer the call of the stones, and that the living were beginning to follow. At Fort St. James, hardened sailors avoided the night shifts, unwilling to sit alone with the headphones while the pulses drummed like a second heartbeat. The island had become more than an anomaly. It was a beacon, and now the world around it was moving in response. By late spring, Washington could no longer deny what was happening in Prince William Sound. The Navy's reports were contradictory, fragmented, and haunted by words that had no place in military documents. Whispers, shadows, processions. A decision was made behind closed doors. A covert scientific mission would be dispatched to Nunavaktak, authorized at the highest level. The team arrived unannounced at Fort St. James, flown in under cover of night. There were 7 of them. 2 physicists from government laboratories, their credentials classified. A geophysicist from the U.S. Geological Survey. A psychiatrist specializing in combat trauma, and 3 men who did not give their names but carried themselves like intelligence officers. They spoke little to the sailors, avoided eye contact, and moved with an unsettling precision. Everyone on the base knew they were not ordinary researchers. On their second day, they hauled crates of equipment across the ice to the island. Seismic drills, ground-penetrating radar, and portable spectrometers were arranged in neat grids across the spirals. The machines buzzed and whirred, probing beneath the surface. The results silenced even the skeptics. Each spiral, it turned out, sat atop a hollow chamber buried 30 feet below the stone. Perfectly spherical cavities, each nearly 40 feet wide, linked to one another by narrow tunnels. Their walls were not ordinary granite, but laced with crystalline structures that glittered under the radar like frozen stars. When the geophysicist mapped the pattern, his hands shook. The network was too precise, too symmetrical. It resembled not natural caves, but a system designed for purpose. Samples chipped from the surface stones revealed the same material. Dense granite infused with black crystals that defied classification. Under magnification, the crystals displayed geometric patterns that shifted as the light moved, like three-dimensional maps rearranging themselves. One of the physicists, Dr. Leonard Price, grew increasingly agitated as the days passed. He refused to leave the instruments, scribbling pages of symbols in his notebooks, circles within circles, spirals that mimicked the very patterns under his feet. He claimed the crystals were not random inclusions but navigational glyphs. Their coordinates, he insisted, voice trembling. Not for space, for time. A lattice of safe routes, pathways across centuries. Someone built this to travel. The others dismissed his words as exhaustion, but the psychiatrist noted his behavior with concern. Price's pupils were dilated, his speech disjointed. He complained of voices at night, urging him to step into the flow. By the fifth day, the entire group showed signs of strain. The geophysicist admitted she no longer trusted her own instruments. Timestamps refused to match, watches slowed or jumped ahead without cause. The intelligence officers reported vivid dreams of walking endless stone corridors, blue eyes watching them from the dark. Even the psychiatrist confessed to sudden gaps in memory, entire hours lost without explanation. The official logs remained clinical. Measurements of field strength, diagrams of subsurface chambers, pages of spectral analysis. But the private journals told another story. Paranoia spreading like an infection, tempers fraying, an invisible pressure that bent the mind as surely as gravity bends light. On the sixth night, Price vanished from his tent. They found him at dawn, standing barefoot in the largest spiral, his notebook clutched to his chest. His lips moved soundlessly, eyes locked on the central stone. When they dragged him away, he fought like a man possessed, screaming that he had seen the gates open, that the path was clear, that they were wasting time. The mission ended abruptly. The intelligence officers ordered an evacuation, citing loss of operational stability. No one argued. The scientists left behind most of their equipment, too shaken to retrieve it. The psychiatrist's final report was blunt. Exposure to sight exerts destabilizing influence on cognition and memory. Subjects develop compulsive ideation centered on spirals and temporal displacement. Recommend immediate suspension of further study until protective protocols exist. But even after they returned to Washington, the team did not recover. Price was committed to a private facility after attempting to carve spirals into his own arms. The geophysicist resigned, claiming she no longer trusted her perception of time. And those nameless agents, whatever their true identities, refused to speak of what they had seen. Nunavaktak remained silent and waiting. Yet the sense among those who had walked its surface was unmistakable. The island was not a ruin, not a relic. It was active, and with every passing week, its influence reached further, pulling the living world into its orbit like a tide that could not be resisted. It happened just after midnight. The air above Nunavaktak was deathly still, the ice groaning faintly under the weight of winter. Then, without warning, the spirals began to glow. Not all at once, but in strict sequence. One ring igniting, then the next, until all 13 pulsed in a rhythm that spread across the island like a heartbeat. The light was cold and blue, seeping from between the stones as though something beneath the ground was stirring. The men who witnessed it later swore the spirals were not random patterns but signals, a message written across the frozen earth. The sequence repeated again and again, each cycle faster than the last, as if preparing for an arrival. And then the air grew heavy, thick with a charge that prickled against the skin. From the center of the largest spiral, a shape began to take form. At first it looked like smoke rising against the wind, twisting unnaturally, refusing to disperse. The smoke condensed, darkened, until it became the vague outline of a figure. Robed in black, Tall, its face shrouded in shadow. Only the eyes showed, 2 points of pale fire that flickered in time with the pulsing light of the stones. When it spoke, the sound seemed to come from the air itself, broken and warped, as though filtered through failing machinery. The words were English, yet not. Syllables twisted with older tones, fragments of ancient dialects carried by the indigenous peoples of the coast. The voices overlapped, layered, impossible and terrifying. "You are the blood," it said. "The children of those who built the gates. The passage draws near." The officers and scientists stood frozen, their breath fogging the air. Some swore they felt the words inside their bones, vibrating through marrow rather than through ears. One of the men dropped to his knees, clutching his head, weeping as though something deep within him recognized the truth of what had been spoken. The figure lifted its head, the glow of its eyes burning brighter. The spirals surged with light one final time, then collapsed into darkness, leaving only silence. The apparition faded like smoke dissolving into the wind. But the words remained, echoing in every mind that heard them. "The children of those who built the gates. The passage draws near." The end began with the radars. Operators at Fort St. James reported multiple contacts above the sound. Then dozens, then hundreds. Unidentified objects hovered in tight formation over Nunavaktak and the neighboring islands. Some were the size of fighter jets, others massive disks glowing with a cold, blue light. They did not move like aircraft but drifted in spirals, their paths mirroring the stone rings on the ground below. The Air Force scrambled interceptors out of Elmendorf. Pilots reported immediate system failures as they approached the bay. Controls went slack, instruments spun wildly, and every jet was forced into the same circular pattern, trapped in invisible currents. "It was like the sky itself was pulling us," one pilot later confessed. Only when they retreated miles away did control return to their hands. None dared approach again. At sea, Navy divers sent to investigate reported something even more impossible. Beneath the ice, in water black as oil, they found the outline of a structure. An enormous labyrinth carved into the bedrock of the ocean floor. Its corridors stretched for hundreds of yards, walls gleaming with the same mirror-smooth stone as the island spirals. And at its heart stood a crystal tower nearly 30 feet tall, glowing with a steady inner light. The divers could not approach. Pressure forced them back, a wall of unseen energy radiating from the core. One described the sensation as standing before a heartbeat the size of a mountain. Then came the broadcast. At 5:02 a.m. Every frequency across North America crackled to life. Civilian radios, military channels, even televisions transmitted the same sound. A sequence of pulses layered with voices speaking in distorted English and fragments of ancient tongues. The message repeated for hours, unstoppable, inescapable. Most who heard it could not understand the words, but the meaning pressed itself into their minds. The gates are opening. The time of passage is near. Washington moved quickly. Within weeks, the bay was sealed, declared a restricted federal preserve. Officially, it was to protect fragile wildlife and cultural sites. In truth, it was to bury the anomaly in silence. Fort St. James was abandoned, its men reassigned, their memories dismissed as stress, exhaustion, hallucination. Reports vanished into locked archives. The story ended, at least on paper, but those who had lived through it could never escape. Years later, long after their service, they still woke in the night to the sound of pulses beating faintly through static. Some swore they heard voices whispering in the darkness, the same broken words carried across frozen air. They never spoke openly of it, but in their silence lay the same fear, that Nunavaktak had not gone dormant, that the gates were waiting still, and that one night the call would return.